The heavy vellum of the 1886 Mitchell's New General Atlas feels wrong. It is too thick, too resilient, as if the paper itself is trying to hold back the weight of the ink it carries. I found it in a basement in Brussels, tucked behind a stack of colonial administrative ledgers that no one had touched since the Great War. The air in that room smelled of damp limestone and institutional decay. I opened the map of Asia, expecting the familiar Victorian sprawl of the Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty. Instead, I saw it, a name that should have been a ghost by the late 19th century, Grand Tartaria. It sat there, etched in a fading but defiant crimson hue, stretching across the vast, frozen heart of the Eurasian continent. Ask yourself why a prestigious American cartographer, decades after the supposed total integration of Central Asia, would still recognize a sovereign entity that the history books tell us was erased by the mid-17th century. Not an error, not a printing fluke, something else. The lines of the borders were precise, following the natural load distribution of the mountain ranges and the ancient river systems. They did not look like the aspirational sketches of a distant explorer. They looked like the recorded reality of a state. I began to trace the ink with my finger, feeling the subtle indentation of the plate press. Why do the archives in London list this land as a desolate wasteland of nomadic tribes, while the maps of the same era suggest a structured, bordered civilization? We are taught that maps follow the flag, that they are the receipts of conquest. But what if the map is a confession? What if the ink is the only thing that survived a systematic global erasure of a culture that didn't fit the burgeoning industrial narrative of the West? I looked closer at the typography. The letters were serifed, bold, and positioned with a geographic authority that demanded recognition. This was not a footnote, this was a nation. The silence of the archive is never truly silent. It hums with the vibration of suppressed data. As I moved from the atlas to the peripheral correspondence of the era, a pattern began to emerge. It was a pattern of absence. In the diplomatic cables of 1886, there are gaps. There are references to territories that have no names, to provisional administrative zones that encompass millions of square miles. Ask yourself how a civilization can simply vanish from the collective consciousness while its physical infrastructure remains. I walked through the streets of the city that night, looking at the stone foundations of the older buildings. We see the neoclassical columns and the grand arches, and we call them revivalist. We are told that 19th century architects were simply obsessed with the aesthetic of Rome and Greece. But look at the scale. Look at the sheer mass of the granite blocks. This is not the work of a young fledgling industrial society using steam-powered pulleys. This is the output of a high-energy civilization. I started to wonder if the 1886 map wasn't an outdated relic, but a final, desperate record of a world that was being physically dismantled. Not just renamed, not just conquered, reset. We see the evidence in the mud flood layers of our great cities, where the first floors of magnificent structures are buried deep beneath the current street level. The official explanation is sewage management or changing grades. But look at the windows. Look at the doors that lead into the dirt. Ask yourself if you would build a masterpiece only to bury its most ornate features in the mud. It is a question of institutional gatekeeping. If you control the narrative of the past, you control the potential of the future. The map I held was a crack in that control. It was a lingering witness to a different power structure, one that utilized atmospheric energy and built with a geometric precision that defies the primitive tools we are told they possessed. I tracked the cartographer's sources to a series of suppressed French surveys from the 1870s. These documents spoke of unclaimed stone cities in the Siberian interior, cities with paved roads and complex irrigation that predated the Russian expansion by centuries. The historians call these ruins of unknown origin. They use the word unknown as a shield, a way to stop the inquiry before it reaches the dangerous truth. What if these cities were not ruins? What if they were the functioning hubs of the Tartarian network, active and vibrant right up until the mid-19th century? The timeline is staccato, broken by strange anomalies. The Great Fire of London, the Great Fire of Chicago, the burning of the Library of Congress, the destruction of the archives in Moscow. Not a coincidence, not a series of accidents, a cleansing. Every time a new power structure rises, it must burn the records of the one it replaced. They tell us that the 1886 map was an anachronism, a mistake made by a tired clerk. But the clerk wasn't tired, he was honest. He was drawing what was still there before the final waves of the modernization program swept the last vestiges of the old world into the incinerator. I started to look at the photographs from the 1880s, the early daguerreotypes of San Francisco, Moscow, and Beijing. The streets are empty, the buildings are massive, ornate, and seemingly ancient, yet the people in the photos look like refugees. They are dressed in rags, pushing wooden carts past monolithic stone pillars. They do not look like the builders. They look like the inheritors of a ghost world. They are the survivors of a cataclysm that has been scrubbed from the textbooks. Think about the architecture of the 1880s World Fairs, the White City of Chicago in 1893. They tell us these were temporary structures built of plaster and wood, designed to be torn down after 6 months, yet in the photographs they look like solid marble. They have electric lighting that far surpassed the capabilities of the surrounding cities. They have fountains that defy the hydraulic pressure of the time. Ask yourself, why would a society spend billions of dollars to build a dream city just to burn it to the ground? Or was it not built? Was it uncovered? Was the World's Fair a reveal of the old Tartarian infrastructure, repurposed as a temporary spectacle to convince the public that the new regime was capable of such feats? The 1886 map places Tartaria right where the most magnificent of these ruined or temporary civilizations were said to have existed. The map is the key to the architectural lie. It provides the sovereign context for the buildings we are told were just fashions. The staccato rhythm of the demolition crews in the late 19th century matches the staccato rhythm of the pen strokes that crossed Tartaria off the later maps. Not a transition, not a natural decline, a hostile takeover of a global energy grid. When you look at the old star, forts, those massive geometric earthworks found on every continent, you are told they are defensive fortifications. But look at the geometry. They are frequency resonators. They are built on ley lines. They are part of a world that understood the load distribution of the Earth's own magnetic field. And the 1886 map is the last official document that identifies the owners of that technology. The institutional erasure is most evident in the way we categorize pre-Columbian or pre-imperial history. We are taught to see the world as a series of disconnected tribes until the Europeans arrived with their science. But the 1886 map shows a unified geographic concept of Tartaria that spans continents. It suggests a global trade network, a global architectural style, and a global understanding of atmospheric electricity. Have you ever wondered why the spires of old cathedrals are topped with intricate metal rods? They tell us they are for bells or crosses. They tell us they are for aesthetics. They are something else. They are antennas. They were drawing power from the ether, providing free energy to a world that didn't need coal or oil. This is the forbidden knowledge. If the public knew that a global civilization had mastered free energy and harmonious architecture a mere 150 years ago, the current economic structures would collapse. The 1886 map had to be corrected. The people had to be re-educated. The orphans of the late 19th century, the millions of foundlings shipped on trains across America and Europe, were the blank slates. They were the children of the Tartarians, separated from their heritage, told they were pioneers in a new world. They were given a new history, a new timeline, and a new sense of scarcity. They were taught that the massive stone buildings around them were built by their own grandfathers with hammers and chisels, a physical impossibility that we still accept today. I moved my investigation to the coastal records of the Pacific Northwest. In 1886, the official narrative says the region was a wilderness of fur trappers, but the maps of the era, the ones they keep in the restricted stacks, show cities. They show Tartarian colonies with names that have been overwritten by Latin or English substitutes. The erasure wasn't just in the books, it was in the land itself. They renamed the mountains, they diverted the rivers, they blasted the stone carvings off the cliffs. What if the great explorers, like Lewis and Clark, weren't discovering new lands, but were actually surveyors for an occupying force, mapping the ruins of a defeated empire? Ask yourself why every state capital in the United States looks like a Roman temple. Why does a new country, struggling to survive in a wilderness, build its administrative centres with massive domes and Corinthian columns? Because they didn't build them, they occupied them. The 1886 map is the smoking gun of this occupation. It shows the transition point. It is the moment when the mask slipped. The cartographers hadn't yet received the updated official history from the central ministries. They were still working off the reality of the ground. They were still acknowledging the giant in the room, and that giant had a name, Tartaria, a name that implies a different origin of man, a different understanding of the stars, and a different relationship with the earth. The skepticism of authority begins when you realize that the Renaissance and the Enlightenment might be labels for the same process of systematic theft. We are told that knowledge was lost and then found, not lost. Stolen, not found, deciphered. The 1886 map shows that the process of reclaiming the Tartarian knowledge was still ongoing in the late 19th century. The Industrial Revolution was not an invention of new technology, it was the crude, polluting adaptation of the clean, elegant Tartarian technology. We replaced the etheric spires with smokestacks. We replaced the archival, star forts with prisons. We replaced the 1886 map with a world of fragmented, warring nation-states. This fragmentation is the primary tool of control. If the world is divided into East and West, if Tartaria is relegated to a Russian province, then the global nature of the previous civilization is hidden. The intellectual provocation lies in the scale of the lie. It is too big to see, like a mountain when you are standing at its base. You see only the rocks and the trees. You do not see the peak. The 1886 map is the aerial view. It allows us to see the peak. It allows us to see the shape of the world before the clouds of modernity were manufactured to obscure it. I found a diary in a small library in rural Maine, written by a surveyor who worked on the railroads in 1886. He wrote about finding old iron buried in the tracks, rails that were already there, leading into the mountains, built with a gauge that didn't match the Union Pacific. he wrote about the silent people who lived in the stone valleys, who spoke a language that sounded like a mix of Latin and Turkic. He wrote that his superiors told him to forget the iron and ignore the people. Not an accident, not a misunderstanding, a directive. The railroads weren't being built across the plains, they were being repaired. The telegraph lines weren't being invented, they were being restrung on existing poles. The 1886 map confirms this infrastructure. It shows the nodes of connection that the new empires were racing to claim, the scramble for Africa, the great game in Asia. These weren't just about resources, they were about the hardware. They were about who would control the leftover tech of the Tartarian world. The map is a ledger of the remaining assets, and as the ink dried on that atlas, the last of those assets were being nationalized by the new world order. The somber reality of our situation is that we are a species with amnesia. We walk through cities of giants and think we are the giants. We look at the 1886 map and laugh at the primitive cartography, never realizing that the map is more accurate than our own history books. The tension of this investigation comes from the realization that the evidence is everywhere once you know what to look for. It is in the ornamental ironwork on your local post office. It is in the decorative towers of the university. It is in the 1886 map that shouldn't exist. This is the forbidden knowledge that we are living in the ruins of a better world. We are the scavengers of a high civilization. We take their temples and turn them into courthouses. We take their power stations and turn them into cathedrals. We take their maps and call them mistakes. But the map doesn't lie. It sits there in the archives, a silent witness to a truth that is both unsettling and provocative. It tells us that we were once unified. It tells us that we once had more, and it tells us that someone went to great lengths to make us forget. What if the 1886 map is not a record of what was, but a warning of what could be? If a global civilization as vast and advanced as Tartaria can be erased in a century, what does that say about our own digital age? Our records are even more fragile. Our maps are lines of code on a server that can be deleted with a single keystroke. The erasure of Tartaria was a physical process: fire, dynamite, and re-education. The erasure of our era will be even more efficient. Ask yourself, who writes the maps of tomorrow? Who decides which nations are official and which are myths? The 1886 map is an unresolved philosophical open loop. It suggests that history is not a linear progression from primitive to advanced, but a series of cycles, of resets and redactions. It leaves us standing in the basement of a Brussels archive, holding a piece of vellum that contradicts everything we've been told. We are left with the silence of the map and the noise of the lie. We are left to wonder if we are the masters of our destiny, or if we are simply the current tenants of a house we don't understand, living under a lease that is about to expire, according to a map we weren't supposed to see. The resonance of that 1886 map acts as a frequency, a low, thrumming vibration that unsettles the bones of modern historiography. If Tartaria existed as a peer to the British and Russian empires during the height of the Victorian era, then the Crimean War was not a regional skirmish over holy sites. It was a world war. It was the systematic dismantling of the Tartarian coastal defences by a coalition of emerging powers. Ask yourself why the uniforms of that era, the heavy wool, the brass buttons, the tall shakos, look identical from London to St. Petersburg to Washington. It is not fashion. It is a uniform of occupation. When I looked at the logistical records of the mid-19th century, I found that the colonization of the American West and the conquest of the East followed the exact same tactical patterns. The star forts were the first to be seized. These geometric masterpieces, often attributed to French engineers like Vauban, are found in the middle of the desert, on the shores of Lake Ontario, and in the heart of the Eurasian steppe. They are the load distribution points of a global defensive and energetic grid. The 1886 map aligns with these points with a terrifying precision. It suggests that the Wild West was not a wilderness, but a scorched earth zone, where the previous inhabitants were cleared to make way for the new administrative reality. Not a settlement, not a migration, something else. The institutional gatekeeping of our universities ensures that any mention of a unified Tartarian culture is met with a condescending smirk. They call it a geographical term for a vast region. They compare it to calling the Middle East the Orient, but the Orient was never listed on an official 1886 map as a sovereign nation with defined borders, a capital, and a standing administrative status. The pseudo-academic language used to dismiss these maps is a form of linguistic camouflage. By calling it a region, they strip it of its agency, its laws, and its history. But look at the architecture of the Tartarian style, the red brick, the arched windows, the copper domes. You see it in the old textile mills of Massachusetts, the government buildings of Vladivostok, and the abandoned hospitals of Melbourne. This is a global aesthetic that required a global supply chain. In 1886, the world was supposedly disconnected, yet the buildings are indistinguishable. Ask yourself, how did a mason in 1880s Ohio know the exact structural proportions used by a mason in 1880s Omsk? They didn't share a textbook, they shared an empire. The 1886 map is the final ledger of that shared reality before it was fractured into the nationalist silos we inhabit today. We are taught to be proud of our national styles, unaware that they are merely the scavenged remnants of a singular, superior architectural tradition. As I delved deeper into the technical specifications of 19th century infrastructure, the skepticism of authority became a necessity for survival. I examined the great reservoirs built in the 1880s across the British colonies. These structures use hydraulic principles that modern engineers struggle to replicate without high-powered pumps. They were built to move water using nothing but the atmospheric pressure and the natural curvature of the earth. The 1886 map indicates these reservoirs were part of a larger Tartarian irrigation network that turned the Gobi Desert and the American Great Basin into fertile plains. We are told these areas have always been arid wastelands, but the map says otherwise. It shows forests where there are now dunes. It shows lakes where there is now salt. What if the climate change of the 19th century was a deliberate act of environmental warfare? What if the destruction of the Tartarian water management systems is what created the deserts we see today? The Dust Bowl and the Great Famine are presented as natural disasters, but the staccato rhythm of their occurrence suggests a calculated sabotage. Break the water, break the food, break the people, then rewrite the map. The erasure trope is most visible in the great fires that plagued every major city between 1870 and 1910. Chicago, Boston, Seattle, Toronto, Moscow, Constantinople, they all burned. And from the ashes, they all rose as modern cities. But look at the before photos. The buildings that burned were made of stone, marble, and iron. Stone does not burn. Marble does not turn to ash in a common house fire. Yet these cities were levelled to the ground. Ask yourself, what kind of heat is required to liquefy granite? Not a kerosene lamp, not a knocked over candle, something else. The 1886 map was printed in the middle of this global incineration. It was a snapshot taken while the world was still smouldering. The modernization that followed was a massive cover-up operation. They cleared the rubble of the Tartarian palaces and replaced them with the boxy, utilitarian structures of the industrial age. They told us it was progress. They told us it was safety. But really, it was the elimination of evidence. If the stone buildings remained, we would ask who built them. If they are gone, we only have the stories they give us. I began to notice a contrast of scale between the human figures in old photographs and the doors of the buildings they inhabited. In the late 1880s, people were small, malnourished, and seemingly overwhelmed by the scale of their environment. The doors are 20 feet high, the steps are deep, the ceilings are cavernous. These are not buildings designed for a 5-foot-tall Victorian clerk. They are buildings designed for a different stature of being. The 1886 map, in its minute detail, lists cities in the far north, territories now considered uninhabitable, that were once bustling hubs of this large-scale civilization. We are told the giants are a myth, a fairy tale for children, but the architecture is the physical proof of their existence. The load distribution of these massive arches was calculated for a weight and a height that exceeds our own. The institutional erasure has extended to our very biology. They have shrunk our history, and in doing so, they have shrunk our sense of what is possible. The 1886 map is a reminder that the world was once built for something greater than the labourers of the industrial machine. There is a tense, unsettling silence in the archives regarding the orphan trains of the 1880s and 90s. Hundreds of thousands of children with no known parents were shipped from the east coast of America to the west. At the same time, similar resettlement programs were happening in Russia and Australia. Where did these children come from? The official answer is poverty and urban decay. But what if they were the survivors of the Tartarian cities? What if they were the re-education generation? By separating children from their parents, you break the oral tradition. You break the memory of the old world. You can tell a child anything, and it becomes their truth. You can tell them that the massive stone dome in the centre of town was built by pioneers 6 years ago, and they will believe you because they have no one to tell them otherwise. The 1886 map was the last document intended for the adults who still remembered. After that, the maps were changed for the children. The name Tartaria was replaced by Russia, or unorganized territory. The history was reset. The foundlings became the first generation of the new narrative. I investigated the antiquiography of the 1880s, the strange high-tech devices that appear in the background of early films and photos, wireless streetlights, electric carriages that didn't need tracks, strange atmospheric harps that sat on the roofs of houses. These were the tools of the Tartarian world. In the 1886 map, the symbols used for industrial centres are not the smokestacks we see in later atlases. They are geometric shapes, stars and circles. They represent the energy nodes of the etheric grid. After 1886, these devices disappear. They are replaced by wires, miles and miles of copper wire strung across the world to charge us for the energy that was once free. This is the ultimate institutional gatekeeping. To turn a natural, ubiquitous resource into a metered commodity, you must first destroy the evidence that it was ever free. You must destroy the civilization that used it. You must burn their books, level their cities, and rename their lands. The 1886 map is a lingering receipt for a debt the world forgot it was owed. The rhythmic, staccato sound of the steam hammer became the heartbeat of the 1890s. It was the sound of the new world crushing the old. In the basement of a museum in Prague, I found a collection of Tartarian coins dated 1882. They are made of a strange, lightweight alloy that doesn't tarnish. They feature a griffin, the symbol of the Tartarian Empire, and a series of astronomical charts. The museum curators have them labelled as fantasy tokens or theatrical props. Ask yourself, why would a theatre mint thousands of high-quality alloy coins with complex celestial data? They wouldn't. The coins are real. The money was real. The economy was real. But because it doesn't fit the 1886 official narrative of a primitive nomadic East, it must be dismissed as a fantasy. The intellectual provocation here is that the fantasy is actually our reality, and the props are the only real things left. We are living in a stage set, constructed over the ruins of a global powerhouse. The somber realization is that the 1886 map was likely a mistake of timing. It was published just as the Great Reset was being finalized. The editors hadn't yet been told that Tartaria was officially over. It is a glitch in the matrix of history. When you look at it, you are seeing a version of the world that was supposed to be deleted. The tension arises when you realize that if they lied about this, they have lied about everything. The timeline of human development is not a gradual ascent. It is a series of collapses and forced restarts. We are currently in the middle of one of those restarts, believing we are at the pinnacle of human achievement, while the 1886 map mocks us from the shadows of the archive. It tells us that we are not the first to have global communication. We are not the first to have worldwide travel. We are merely the latest to occupy the space. As I close the Mitchell's Atlas, the weight of the forbidden knowledge feels like a physical burden. The investigation doesn't end here. It merely shifts. The 1886 map is a doorway. Beyond it lies a world of free energy, atmospheric resonance, and a unified human history that was stolen from us in the span of a single lifetime. We are left with rhetorical questions that have no easy answers. What if we are the barbarians who moved into the temples of a fallen god? What if our entire scientific understanding is a set of workarounds for technologies we no longer understand? The map remains, the ink remains. The 1886 official map that still listed Tartaria as a nation is not an error of the past. It is a haunting blueprint for a future we are not yet ready to reclaim. The loops of history are closing and the patterns are repeating. The question is no longer whether Tartaria existed. The question is, what will they call our world after the next reset, and which map will they accidentally leave behind for the next investigator to find in a basement? I turned my attention to the Great Wall of China. The 1886 map depicts it not as a Chinese defense against northern barbarians, but as a Tartarian defense against the south. Look at the embrasures. Look at the way the battlements are facing. They face south. Not north, south. The official history tells us the Ming dynasty built it to keep the nomads out, but the nomads were the Tartarians. Why would you build a wall with the fortifications on the wrong side? Unless the wall wasn't yours, unless you were the one being kept out. The 1886 map is one of the last to show the Chinese Tartary as a distinct, separate administrative zone that controlled the wall. This is a classic example of institutional erasure. After the takeover, the history was flipped. The victors claimed the wall as their own, a symbol of national pride, while hiding the fact that it was originally a barrier built by their enemies. Ask yourself, how much of our national heritage is actually the captured spoils of a defeated neighbour? The investigative essayist must always look for the anomalies in the load distribution of the narrative. In the late 1880s, there was a sudden global obsession with mental asylums. Massive, palace-like structures were built in the middle of nowhere to house thousands of people. These buildings often looked like the star forts or the Tartarian palaces, grand, ornate, and far too sophisticated for their stated purpose. Why were so many people being locked away? Who were they? What if these weren't patients? What if they were the dissidents of the old world? The ones who refused to accept the new history, the ones who remembered the free energy and the true map. By labelling them insane, the new authorities could effectively erase their testimony. The 1886 map represents the world they remembered, a world that was being physically and mentally dismantled. The asylums were the processing centres for the human remnants of Tartaria. Think about the catacombs under Paris, Odessa, and Rome. Hundreds of miles of tunnels lined with millions of bones. The official story is that they were overflow from cemeteries. But look at the sheer volume. Look at the way the bones are stacked neatly, geometrically, almost artistically. This is not the work of hurried gravediggers. This is a mass disposal. The 1886 map shows these cities as the hubs of the old world. What if the catacombs are the result of the cleansing that took place during the transition? What if the millions of skeletons are the original inhabitants of the Tartarian cities, cleared out to make room for the new citizens? The contrast of scale between the grand boulevards above and the bone-filled tunnels below is a sombre testament to the price of the modern world. We walk on the dead of a civilization we aren't allowed to name. The rhythm of the erasure is almost musical. A fire here, a flood there, a new discovery of ancient history somewhere else. By 1886, the music was reaching a crescendo. The technical terms of the era, manifest destiny, the civilizing mission, the white man's burden, were all euphemisms for the final mop-up operation. They used technical terms like standardization to justify the destruction of local weights, measures, and calendars. They replaced the lunisolar Tartarian systems with the rigid Gregorian calendar. They broke the connection between man and the cosmos. The 1886 map is a relic of that older timekeeping, a ghost of a world where geography was aligned with the stars, not with the needs of a central bank. I found an old photograph of a Tartarian prince from 1884. He is wearing a silk robe that appears to have integrated metallic threads. He is holding a staff that glows with a faint internal light. He doesn't look like a primitive nomad. He looks like a high-tech aristocrat. The photograph was found in a box labelled Vaudeville Costumes. This is how they hide the truth. They turn it into a joke. They turn it into a costume. They take the sovereign leaders of a global empire and relegate them to the circus or the sideshow. The 1886 map is the only thing that gives that costume back its dignity. It proves that the man in the photo had a country. He had a home, he had a people, and all of it was taken from him by a cabal of bankers and explorers who redrew the world in their own image. The inquisitive mind must ask, where did the technology go? If the Tartarians had free energy and atmospheric electricity, why are we burning coal? The answer is in the load distribution of power. Free energy cannot be controlled, it cannot be taxed, it cannot be used to enslave a population. To build the modern world, the architects of the reset had to replace the clean, wireless technology of Tartaria with the clunky, wired technology of the 20th century. They had to create an artificial scarcity. They had to make us believe that energy is something you have to dig for, rather than something that is all around us. The 1886 map is the X on the treasure map of human potential. It shows us where we were before the wires were wrapped around our necks. The skepticism of authority is not a choice. It is a duty. When you look at the 1886 map, you are seeing the truth that they forgot to hide. You are seeing the evidence of a global erasure. You are seeing the names of the cities they renamed, the borders they dissolved, and the people they disappeared. The script of history is written by the victors, but they are clumsy writers. They leave typos. They leave 1886 maps in the basements of Brussels. They leave star forts in the deserts. They leave 20-foot doors for 5-foot people. These are the clues to our true identity. We are not the pioneers of a new world. We are the amnesiac survivors of an old one. The investigative essayist knows that the unresolved philosophical open loop is the most powerful tool in the kit. It keeps the mind moving. It prevents the stagnation of official truth. As I finish this narrative, I am left with a sense of profound loss, but also a sense of profound possibility. If Tartaria existed in 1886, then the world is much younger than we. Think. The reset is fresh. The paint is still wet. This means the knowledge is still there, buried just beneath the surface. It is in the foundations of our buildings. It is in the glitches of our history books. It is in the 1886 map that still lists Tartaria as a nation. We are the investigators. We are the ones who must look past the labels and the temporary structures of our era. What if the 1886 map is not just a record of the past, but a template for the future? As our own modern systems begin to fail, as the energy grid becomes more unstable and the official narratives more desperate, the Tartarian model becomes more relevant. A world of harmonious architecture, free energy, and global cooperation. Not this world of concrete boxes and constant surveillance, something else. The 1886 map is a reminder that another way of living is possible. It has been done before. It was being done as recently as 1886. The silence of the archive is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of our investigation. Ask yourself, what else are they hiding? What other maps are tucked away in the restricted stacks? What other nations are waiting to be rediscovered? The final somber truth is that the 1886 map is a mirror. It shows us our own fragility. It shows us that everything we take for granted, our nations, our history, our progress, is just ink on paper. It can be changed. It can be erased. It can be rewritten. We must be the keepers of the ink. We must be the ones who refuse to let the map be corrected. We must be the ones who remember the name Tartaria, because if we forget the past, we have no say in the future. The investigation continues. The evidence is mounting. The 1886 map is just the first page. Ask yourself, what will you find when you start to look? What if the world you know is just a map that was drawn yesterday? What if the real world is still out there, waiting for you to find it? The rhythmic percussion of the 1880s was not merely the sound of steam, it was the sound of the pneumatic hammer shattering the marble faces of an older world. We are told the classical revival was a choice made by architects sitting in wood-panelled offices in London and New York. Not a choice, a reclamation. Look at the photographs of the great cities of 1886, St. Petersburg, San Francisco, Buenos Aires. They are identical. The same massive stone foundations, the same intricate friezes, the same oversized doorways that make the Victorian gentleman in his top hat look like a child playing in a giant's nursery. Ask yourself why a civilization supposedly reliant on horse-drawn carriages and hand-cranked cranes would build with such unnecessary monumental scale. The load distribution of these buildings is not calculated for the weight of timber and brick. It is calculated for the weight of eternity. The 1886 map is the ledger that identifies the original owners of this global masonry. We are told the Tartars were a primitive nomadic force, yet the maps place them in the very regions where these megalithic structures are most concentrated. It is a question of institutional erasure. If you can convince a population that they built the world they inherited, you can make them pay for its upkeep. You can sell them the energy that the buildings were originally designed to harvest for free. Observe the great exhibitions that peppered the timeline of the late 19th century. In 1886, as the Mitchell's Atlas was being printed, preparations were underway for a series of international fairs that would showcase human progress. These fairs were built in record time, sometimes in less than a year. They featured massive palaces, artificial lagoons, and electrical grids that lit up the night like the sun. And then, as soon as the fairs ended, they were dynamited. They were burned, they were cleared. The official story is that they were temporary, built of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp. But look at the surviving photographs. Look at the way the water reflects off the solid stone pillars. Look at the statues that would take a master sculptor a lifetime to carve. Ask yourself, why would any society destroy the most beautiful things it ever created, unless they weren't the creators, unless the fairs were controlled reveals of Tartarian cities that had been captured and cleaned? Once the public had been sufficiently dazzled and the new technology of the victors had been introduced, the evidence of the old world had to be removed. The 1886 map is the silent witness to this transition. It shows the sovereign entity that was being physically dismantled under the guise of world's fairs. The staccato rhythm of the late 19th century urban renewal programs is the heartbeat of a cover-up, not a renovation, not an improvement, a reset. I found a collection of municipal records from a Midwestern city dated 1886 detailing the lowering of the grade. They were literally burying the first floors of an entire downtown district. They called it a sewage improvement project. But if you go into the basements of those buildings today, you see the tops of ornate stone arches and windows that once looked out onto a sunlit street. They are now 10 feet underground, staring into the dirt. Why bury the most expensive part of a building? Why create a basement that was clearly designed to be a grand entrance? The 1886 map provides the context for this vertical erasure. It shows a civilization that functioned on a different ground level, both literally and figuratively. When the reset happened, whether by natural cataclysm or man-made flood, the new inhabitants simply built on top of the mud. They paved over the past and told us the stairs always led to the basement. The institutional gatekeeping surrounding the age of discovery is designed to prevent us from seeing the 1886 map for what it is, a survival. We are taught that the world was a series of disconnected islands of culture until the age of sail, but the map shows a unified transcontinental entity. It suggests that the Silk Road was not a series of trading posts, but a high-speed internal transit system. Have you ever wondered why old star forts are found in places that have no strategic military value? They are in the middle of the Russian wilderness. They are on the tiny islands of the Caribbean. They are in the heart of the American Midwest. They are not forts. They are something else. They are frequency resonators. They are the energy nodes of the Tartarian grid, designed to harvest atmospheric electricity and distribute it across the map. In 1886, these nodes were being commissioned as military outposts or national monuments. Their true purpose was scrubbed from the technical manuals. The copper domes were stripped, the decorative antennas were melted down, and the world was plugged into a meter. The somber reality is that we are living in the after of a massive global conflict that was never recorded in our textbooks. The Crimean War, the Civil War, the Opium Wars, they were all theatres of the same campaign, the campaign to eliminate Tartaria. The 1886 map is the final pre-update version of the world. It shows the enemy's territory before it was partitioned into Russia, China, and the British Raj. The skepticism of authority must extend to the very names we use for our geography. Siberia is a placeholder. The Orient is a mask. The New World is a lie. It was all the old world. It was all part of a singular, interconnected system of load distribution and energy management. When you look at the 1886 map, you are seeing the nervous system of a giant that was being vivisected by the modern empires. The tension of this realization is that it makes our current world feel temporary. It makes our digital age feel like a flicker in the dark compared to the enduring stone legacy of what came before. I tracked the provenance of the 1886 map to a printer who had formerly worked for the royal courts of Europe. In his private letters, he speaks of the Great Correction. He mentions receiving orders to unlabel certain territories and to redistribute the populations of others. This is the erasure trope in its most literal form. It is the administrative destruction of a culture. They didn't just kill the people, they killed the idea of the people. They turned Tartaria into a geographical expression. They took the grand cities and called them mirages, or ruins of the ancients. They took the technology and called it magic, or primitive superstition. Ask yourself, what would happen if you found a map of your own country tomorrow that listed it as a province of the unknown? How would you fight back against a history that refuses to acknowledge you exist? The 1886 map is the last cry of a civilization that refused to be forgotten, a paper ghost that escaped the fire. The skepticism of the narrative is reinforced by the orphan trains that reached their peak in, you guessed it, the 1880s. Thousands of children with no names and no pasts were shipped to the frontiers. They were told they were the pioneers. They were the blank slates upon which the new history was written. At the same time, the 1886 map shows the unorganized territories where these children were being sent. These were the lands of Tartaria, freshly cleared of their original inhabitants, ready to be discovered by a new generation, that didn't know how to read the buildings they were moving into. The contrast of scale is heartbreaking. A child in rags standing in front of a monolithic stone library that he is told his impoverished government built for him. It is the ultimate gaslighting. It is the institutionalized theft of a heritage, and the 1886 map is the only evidence left in the lost and found of history. Think about the technical terms of architecture: keystone, foundation, load bearing. These are also terms of power. If you control the foundation, you control everything that rises above it. The 1886 map shows that the foundation of our world is Tartarian. Every modern city is built on the ruins of a Tartarian hub. Every ancient road is a Tartarian highway. Every prehistoric canal is a Tartarian waterway. The institutional gatekeepers want us to believe that history is a series of disjointed discoveries. They want us to believe that we are the smartest people who have ever lived. But the 1886 map suggests that we are actually in a period of technological and intellectual decline. We have traded the ether for the wire. We have traded the stone for the plastic. We have traded the truth for the map they gave us to replace the one from 1886. The inquisitive investigator must look at the great surveys of the 1880s. They were called geological surveys, but they were actually inventories. They were cataloguing the spoils of war. They were looking for the remaining star, forts, the remaining energy nodes, and the remaining libraries. The 1886 map is the index for that inventory. It shows where the assets were located before they were nationalized by the emerging central banks. The staccato sentence structure of the survey reports hides the magnitude of what they found. Found stone structure, origin unknown, repurposed for local administration. Not unknown, something else, something that had to be hidden because it didn't fit the industrial narrative. The 1886 map is the before picture in a global makeover that changed the face of the earth. The somber, unsettled feeling you get when looking at the 1886 map comes from the realization that we are the unresolved philosophical open loop. We are the people who don't know who we are. We are the inheritors of a world we are not allowed to understand. The map is a challenge. It is an invitation to investigate the anomalies, to question the authorities, and to see the world with fresh eyes. It asks us to consider the possibility that everything we know is a lie, and that the truth is sitting in a basement in Brussels, etched in crimson ink on a piece of heavy vellum. The 1886 map is not just a historical curiosity, it is a revolutionary document. It is the beginning of the end of the reset, and it is the first step toward reclaiming a history that was stolen from us before we were even born. The silence that followed the publication of the 1886 map was not an accident, it was a policy. In the years immediately following, the map-making industry underwent a massive consolidation. Small independent cartographers who still included Tartaria or independent Tartary on their plates were bought out or shut down. The official maps became the only maps. This is the load distribution of information. If you can channel all the truth through a few central gateways, you can control the shape of reality itself. The 1886 map is a leak in that system. It is a piece of data that wasn't supposed to survive the Great Correction. Ask yourself why we are so comfortable with the idea that maps from 500 years ago are highly accurate, but a map from 100 to 40 years ago is a mistake. It is a psychological barrier, a fence built around our curiosity. I began to look for the Tartarian influence in the music and frequency of the 1880s. The standardized pitch of A equals 440 Hz was introduced during this era. Before that, music was tuned to various frequencies, often 400 to 32 Hz, which is said to be in harmony with the natural resonance of the Earth. The 1886 map shows a world that was still tuned differently. The massive pipe organs in the cathedrals, which were often the energy centers of the Tartarian cities, were designed to vibrate at specific frequencies that promoted health and cohesion. When the reset happened, these frequencies were altered. The organs were retuned or destroyed. The music was standardized. The people were literally put out of sync with their environment. The map is a visual representation of that original harmony, a time when geography and frequency were one. The investigative essayist must confront the erasure of the giants with a skeptical eye. In the 1880s, newspapers were filled with reports of massive skeletons being unearthed across North America and Eurasia. Skeletons 7, 8, 9 feet tall, often found with copper armor and advanced weaponry. And then the Smithsonian Institution would arrive. The bones would be taken for study, and they would never be seen again. Not a conspiracy, not a myth, something else. The 1886 map shows the territories where these giants supposedly lived. If the Tartarians were of a larger stature, then the revivalist architecture finally makes sense. The 20-foot doors weren't for aesthetics, they were for the people who lived there. The institutional gatekeeping of the Smithsonian is the final seal on the Tartarian tomb. The rhythm of my investigation led me to the great walls of the world, not just in China, but the mud brick walls of Russia and the serpent mounds of Ohio. They are all part of the same global defensive and energetic system. The 1886 map shows these features as still being relevant to the borders of the day. They weren't ancient ruins in 1886. They were the edges of a living empire. We are told they are unexplained archaeological anomalies. But unexplained is just a word used by people who are paid not to explain. The 1886 map is the explanation. It shows the world as a unified fortress of energy and stone, a fortress that was breached by the modern world during the transition of the late 19th century. The somber, tense atmosphere of the archives is where the truth goes to die, but it is also where it can be resurrected. I found a map of the underground railways of 1886, not the metaphorical ones, but actual high-speed tunnel systems that connected the major cities of the Tartarian world. They were powered by compressed air and magnetic levitation. We are told the subway was a dirty, steam-filled invention of the 1860s, but the 1886 map shows a network that was far more advanced. After the reset, these tunnels were flooded, walled off, or turned into sewers. We walk over them every day, unaware that a high-speed world exists right beneath our feet. Ask yourself, why would they hide a transportation system? Because if you can travel the world in an hour, you can't be controlled by a national border. The intellectual provocation of the 1886 map is that it suggests our industrial revolution was actually a post-apocalyptic scavenger hunt. We didn't invent the steam engine. We found the designs and made a cruder, dirtier version of it. We didn't invent electricity. We found the wires and figured out how to charge people for them. The 1886 map is the inventory of what was lost. It is the before shot of a world that was clean, efficient, and beautiful. The skepticism of authority becomes a way of life when you realize that the founding fathers and the great inventors were likely just the people who found the keys to the Tartarian warehouses. I found a photograph from 1886 of a Tartarian lighthouse. It didn't use a lamp. It used a massive glowing crystal that could be seen for 50 miles. The official record says it was a burning oil lamp that was exceptionally bright. But look at the light. It is cold. It is blue. It is electric. The 1886 map shows these lighthouses as part of a global navigation system that didn't need fuel. They were the beacons of the ether. After 1886, they were replaced by the standardized lighthouses we see today. The crystals were lost. The technology was forgotten. The map is the only thing that remembers. It is a testament to a world that didn't need to burn things to see in the dark. The contrast of scale between our world and the world of the 1886 map is a measure of our decline. We build with disposable materials. We live in temporary structures. We have planned obsolescence. The Tartarians built for 1,000 years. They built with stone and frequency. They built with the earth, not against it. The 1886 map is a somber reminder of what we could have been. It is a challenge to our modern arrogance. It asks us to look at the massive revivalist buildings in our own cities and ask who really built this and why did they make it so beautiful? The answer is in the map. The answer is in the name they tried to erase. The unresolved philosophical open loop of the 1886 map is the question of what now? If we know the truth, if we see the erasure, what do we do with it? We can't go back to 1886. We can't rebuild the Tartarian Empire, but we can stop believing the lie. We can start to look at our world as a series of reclaimed assets. We can start to look for the free energy that is still there, waiting to be tapped. We can start to read the maps that they forgot to burn. The 1886 official map that still listed Tartaria as a nation is not an end. It is a beginning. It is the first thread in a sweater that, when pulled, will unravel the entire official history of the world. Leaving the archive, the world transforms. Using the 1886 map as a filter, modern architecture reveals a world of ghosts and the erased empire of Tartaria. This map isn't a mistake. It's a revelation of a sovereign nation that refused to die. Official history claims Tartarian commerce was opaque, but it was simply a threat to modern cartels and global wealth distribution. To achieve dominance, empires enacted a monopoly of history, burying the Tartarian alternative. By tracing these crimson borders, we reclaim our liberation and challenge institutional lies. Are you following their map to stay lost, or the real one?